Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest, and where exile can become the doorway to destiny. I'm so glad you are here with me today for another tale of defiance, obsession, and the kind of love that refuses to bow to society's cruelest judgments. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents, from early morning listeners in Sydney to late-night companions in Montreal. Tonight's story takes us to the frost-covered estates of Derbyshire in 1838, where a young woman was cast out of her family home for one unforgivable act: saying no. Banished for refusing to marry an earl's cruel son, she vanished into obscurity, while her family pretended she had never existed. But what no one knew, what even she couldn't have imagined, was that the most feared duke in England had been waiting for this moment. And when he appeared at her cottage door with snow in his dark hair and possession burning in his eyes, everything she thought she knew about her exile shattered. They thought banishment would break her will. They thought isolation would teach her compliance. But when the Duke of Lockwood looked at her and said, "You've been mine since the moment you defied them," the entire world tilted on its axis. What had he seen in her that made him cross half of England in a blizzard? Let me take you back to that December morning when everything changed, when the scent of pine smoke hung heavy in the winter air, and when one woman's refusal became the beginning of an obsession that would consume them both. The morning Rosalind Pemberton was banished from Ashby Park, the world was white with snow. She stood in the entrance hall where she had taken her first steps as a child, her traveling cloak fastened tight against the bitter cold that seeped through every crack in the ancient stone walls. Her single trunk waited by the door, strapped and ready, containing everything she was permitted to take with her. One trunk. 23 years of life reduced to a few gowns, some books, her mother's silver-backed brush, and the miniature portrait of her grandmother that she had hidden beneath her chemises so her father would not confiscate it. Her father refused to look at her. Lord Pemberton stood by the fireplace in the great hall, his back rigid as iron, his hands clasped behind him in that particular way he had when rendering judgment on the tenants who failed to pay their rents or the servants who committed minor infractions. Rosalind had seen that posture countless times throughout her childhood. She had watched him dismiss a groom for drinking, evict a family for being 3 months behind on payments, and refuse aid to a widow whose husband had died working Pemberton lands. She had never imagined that same cold, unyielding stance would be turned on her. But here she was, the errant daughter, the family disgrace. "You understand the terms," her father said, his voice flat and final as a tombstone inscription. "The cottage in Millbrook is yours for as long as you require it. Mrs. Davies will attend you twice weekly to ensure you do not perish from your own stubbornness. Your allowance will be £50 per annum, enough to keep you from actual starvation, but nothing more. You will not return to this house under any circumstances. You will not contact your sisters by letter or any other means. You will not use the Pemberton name in society or trade upon any connection to this family. As far as Ashby Park is concerned, as far as I am concerned, you no longer exist." Rosalind's throat burned with unshed tears, but she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Not when he had already taken everything else from her. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "And if I change my mind?" she asked quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "If I agree to marry Mr. Talbot after all?" Her father finally turned to face her. His expression was carved from the same granite as the family tomb, where generations of Pembertons lay in cold, eternal silence. There was no softness in his eyes, no flicker of paternal affection, No hint that he had ever called her his clever girl or lifted her onto his shoulders to see the summer fair when she was small. "It is too late for that," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "The Talbots have withdrawn their offer. You humiliated their son publicly, Rosalind. You rejected him at the engagement ball, in front of 200 guests, in front of the Earl of Wexford himself. The insult cannot be forgiven or forgotten. No respectable man will have you now. You have ruined yourself, and you have very nearly ruined your sister's prospects as well. Be grateful I am providing you with anything at all, rather than turning you out onto the roads with nothing but the clothes on your back." Rosalind wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him that she had not humiliated anyone, that she had simply told the truth when Mr. Richard Talbot cornered her in the conservatory during the engagement ball and demanded she announce their betrothal immediately. That when he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises that still purpled her skin 3 days later and told her she belonged to him now, that her father had already signed the contracts, that she had no choice in the matter. She had wrenched her arm away and said clearly, loudly, for all the nearby guests to hear, "I will never belong to you. I do not consent to this marriage. I would rather die alone than spend one day as your wife." The guests had heard every word. Of course they had heard. Richard Talbot had made absolutely certain of it, his voice rising in theatrical outrage, his face flushing crimson as he accused her of leading him on, of accepting his courtship under false pretenses, of playing him for a fool while secretly harboring affections for someone else. He had called her a heartless creature, a manipulative witch, a woman of loose morals who had allowed him liberties she now pretended to regret. All lies. Vicious, calculated lies designed to destroy her reputation while salvaging his own wounded pride. Rosalind had stood there in the conservatory, her wrist aching, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, surrounded by shocked faces and whispered speculation, and said the only thing she could say. "I did not accept your courtship, Mr. Talbot. My father did. And I have made my position clear from the very beginning. I do not love you. I do not wish to marry you. And I will not be forced into a union that would make me miserable for the sake of your pride or my father's ambitions." The scandal had been immediate and vicious. Her mother had taken to her bed with smelling salts and a cold compress, refusing to speak to Rosalind or even acknowledge her presence. Her younger sisters, Lydia and Jane, had been whisked away to their aunt's house in Bath within 24 hours to escape the spreading poison of gossip. And her father had summoned her to his study the very next morning and told her, in clipped, furious tones, that she had 1 week to pack her belongings and leave Ashby Park forever. 1 week to say goodbye to the only home she had ever known. 1 week to become a ghost. "The carriage is waiting," Lord Pemberton said now, his tone utterly dismissive, as though he were discussing the departure of a servant rather than his own eldest daughter. "I trust we will not meet again, Rosalind. You have made your choice. You will live with the consequences." Rosalind looked at the man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride when she was 6, who had once called her his clever girl when she solved a mathematical puzzle faster than her tutors expected, who had promised her mother on her deathbed that he would always protect their daughters. She searched his face for some flicker of the father she remembered, some hint of affection or regret, or even simple human compassion. There was nothing. His eyes were cold as winter ice. His mouth was set in a thin, unforgiving line. He looked at her as though she were a stranger, worse than a stranger, an inconvenience to be disposed of, a problem to be solved by removal. "Goodbye, Father," Rosalind said softly, and the word tasted like ashes on her tongue. He did not reply. He simply turned back to the fire, his posture indicating that she had already ceased to exist in his world. The footman, young William, who had taught her to skip stones on the lake when they were children, would not meet her eyes as he carried her trunk to the waiting carriage. His hands trembled slightly as he secured the straps, and Rosalind thought she saw his throat work as though he wanted to speak, but he remained silent. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwell, who had known Rosalind since birth, who had bandaged her scraped knees and brought her warm milk when she had nightmares, stood weeping silently in the doorway of the servants' entrance. But she did not speak either. She did not offer comfort or farewell. She simply pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and watched with red-rimmed eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though Rosalind had already become a ghost, a shameful memory to be buried and forgotten. As the carriage rolled down the long, tree-lined drive away from Ashby Park, Rosalind looked back once. The house where she had grown up, where she had laughed and played and dreamed of the future, sat cold and gray against the white December sky. Snow clung to the gargoyles that leered from the roofline. Icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. No one stood at the windows to wave goodbye. No one watched her leave. The house itself seemed to turn its back on her, ancient and indifferent. She was truly, utterly alone. The journey to Millbrook took 3 hours over roads that were treacherous with ice and snow. Rosalind sat in the freezing carriage, wrapped in her cloak, and watched the familiar landscape of her childhood disappear behind her. The village where she had attended church every Sunday, the farms where she had delivered baskets to tenants at Christmas, the mill pond where she and her sisters had fed the ducks in summer. All of it gone now. All of it lost. When the carriage finally stopped in front of a small stone cottage at the very edge of Millbrook Village, Rosalind felt a strange sense of unreality wash over her. This was her new home. This cramped, drafty building with its sagging roof and crooked chimney, perched at the edge of nowhere like an afterthought. The coachman helped her down without a word and unloaded her trunk onto the snow-covered doorstep. Then he climbed back onto his seat and drove away without looking back, leaving Rosalind standing alone in the winter silence. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the cottage. It was small, so much smaller than anything at Ashby Park. 2 windows flanked a weathered wooden door. Smoke drifted from the chimney, suggesting someone had at least lit a fire inside. The stone walls were old, patched in places with mortar that didn't quite match. The garden, such as it was, lay dormant beneath snow. This was exile. This was punishment. This was the price of saying no. Rosalind picked up her skirts, climbed the 2 steps to the door, and pushed it open. The cottage had 2 rooms downstairs, a parlor that doubled as a dining area, and a small kitchen with a hearth and a stone sink. Upstairs, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step, was a single bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. The furniture was old, but serviceable. A worn settee sat before the parlor fireplace. A scarred wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the space near the kitchen. Everything was clean, at least, though the air smelled of damp and disuse. It was nothing like the grandeur of Ashby Park, with its 20 bedrooms and its formal dining room that could seat 40 guests. But it was hers. Rosalind set her cloak on the back of a chair and stood in the center of the tiny parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, providing meager warmth. The floor was cold beneath her half-boots. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man would have to duck beneath the exposed beams. And yet, standing there in that small, shabby room, Rosalind felt something unexpected unfurl in her chest.
Relief. She was free, truly free, perhaps for the first time in her entire life. No father dictating her every move, no mother criticizing her posture and her accomplishments, no sisters demanding her attention and her sacrifice, No suitors pressing unwanted suits. No society judging her every word and gesture. Just Rosalind. Just this cottage. Just the vast, terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a life that belonged entirely to her. She had paid dearly for this freedom. She had lost her family, her home, her place in society, her future prospects. She had been cast out and labeled a disgrace. But she had not broken. She had not allowed herself to be forced into a marriage that would have slowly killed everything vital and true inside her. If this cottage, this exile, this solitude was the cost of keeping her soul intact, then she would pay it, and she would not regret it. Mrs. Davies arrived that evening just as darkness was falling. She was a sturdy woman of perhaps 50 years, with iron-gray hair pinned severely back from a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She carried a basket laden with provisions, bread still warm from the oven, a small wheel of cheese, a jar of preserves, a covered pot of soup that smelled of vegetables and herbs. "Lord Pemberton sent word you'd be needing help settling in," Mrs. Davies said, setting the basket on the kitchen table with brisk efficiency. "I'll come Tuesdays and Fridays, miss, to clean and bring provisions. If you need anything else particular, you've only to ask and I'll do what I can, though I'll tell you plain that the village isn't much for luxuries." "Thank you," Rosalind said, her voice hoarse from hours of silence and unshed tears. She had not spoken to anyone since leaving Ashby Park that morning. Mrs. Davies studied her with a directness that should have been impertinent, but somehow felt oddly reassuring, as though she were taking Rosalind's measure and finding her worthy of something, though what that something was remained unclear. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you look like you could use a proper meal and a good night's sleep. The cottage gets bitter cold at night when the wind comes down from the hills. I've laid extra blankets on the bed upstairs, and there's wood stacked by the kitchen door for the fires. You'll manage well enough, I think, if you've got any grit about you." "I have grit," Rosalind said quietly, meeting the older woman's eyes. "I would not be here otherwise." Something flickered in Mrs. Davies's expression, approval, perhaps, or respect. "No, I don't suppose you would be." She gestured to the basket. "The soup's still warm. You eat that and get some rest. I'll be back on Tuesday morning to see how you're faring." After Mrs. Davies left, pulling her shawl tight against the wind as she trudged back toward the village center, Rosalind sat alone in the tiny parlor and ladled soup into a chipped bowl. She ate slowly, mechanically, barely tasting the food. The silence was overwhelming. At Ashby Park, there had always been noise. Servants moving through the halls, her sisters practicing pianoforte in the music room, her mother directing the household staff in her carrying voice, the constant hum of activity that came with running a large estate. Here there was nothing but the wind rattling the windows and the occasional pop and hiss of the fire. She should have felt afraid. She should have felt lost and helpless and utterly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had done, the life she had thrown away, the future she had destroyed with a few words spoken in a conservatory. Instead, she felt strangely, impossibly, triumphantly free. She had refused Richard Talbot. She had stood up in front of everyone who mattered in Derbyshire society and said no. She had chosen herself over security, truth over comfort, integrity over survival. She had paid the price for that defiance, yes, but she had not broken. She had not bent. She had not allowed her spirit to be crushed beneath the weight of other people's expectations and demands. If this cottage, this exile, this solitude was the cost of remaining whole, then she would pay it gladly. She would not regret her choice. She would not apologize for choosing herself. And if she lived the rest of her life alone in this small stone cottage at the edge of nowhere, at least she would live that life as herself, complete and undiminished. Maximilian Hartwell, Duke of Lockwood, stood at the window of his London townhouse and stared out at the December rain that fell in cold, relentless sheets against the glass. He had been standing there for the better part of an hour, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, his mind far from the glittering city spread out before him in all its muddy, smoke-choked chaos. He was thinking about Rosalind Pemberton. He had first seen her 2 years ago at an assembly ball in Derby. She had been 21 then, newly presented to society, dressed in a gown of pale yellow silk that made her look like captured sunlight. But it was not her appearance that had arrested his attention and held it fast. It was the way she moved through the ballroom, observing everything, missing nothing, her intelligence written plainly in the tilt of her head and the sharpness of her gaze as she watched the social theater unfold around her. While other young ladies giggled behind their fans and simpered and preened and angled shamelessly for his attention, for the attention of any titled gentleman with adequate fortune and decent teeth, Rosalind Pemberton had barely glanced at him. She had stood near the windows with a glass of lemonade in her hand, and she had watched the dancers with the focused attention of a natural philosopher observing an interesting species of insect. Not with disdain, precisely, but with a kind of detached curiosity that suggested she found the entire enterprise faintly absurd. Maximilian, who was accustomed to being the most sought-after man in any room he entered, who could not cross a ballroom without being accosted by ambitious mothers and their blushing daughters, had found her complete indifference both intriguing and infuriating, also irresistible. He had made inquiries, discreet inquiries, of course, because the Duke of Lockwood did not chase women openly. He had learned that she was the eldest daughter of Lord Pemberton, a minor baron with a modest estate in Derbyshire, and 3 daughters to marry off. That she was. Well-read, well-spoken, and utterly uninterested in the marriage market, despite her family's obvious need for advantageous matches. That she had turned down multiple offers during her first season, including one from a viscount's heir and another from a wealthy merchant's son. That she was, in short, exactly the kind of woman who would destroy him if he let her anywhere near his carefully guarded heart. So he had stayed away. He had watched her from a distance at subsequent balls and assemblies, always careful to maintain his reputation as a man who kept his emotions locked behind walls of ice and iron. The Duke of Lockwood did not fall in love. He did not chase women. He did not allow himself to want anything he could not control absolutely. And yet he wanted Rosalind Pemberton with a ferocity that terrified him down to his bones. When news of the scandal reached London 3 days ago, carried by the eager gossips who made it their business to know every detail of every social catastrophe, Maximilian had felt something crack open inside his chest like ice breaking on a frozen river. She had publicly rejected Richard Talbot. She had refused him at their own engagement ball in front of half the county. And her father had disowned her, banished her, cast her out to live in some cottage in a village Maximilian had to search for on a map. She was suffering because she had refused to compromise herself, because she had chosen integrity over security, because she was brave and principled and unwilling to be broken by men who thought women were property to be managed and controlled, and her family had punished her for it. The rage that swept through Maximilian was cold and absolute and utterly implacable. He set down his brandy glass with enough force that the crystal rang like a bell. He crossed to his desk and pulled out a sheet of writing paper. Within the hour, he had drafted detailed instructions to his most trusted steward. Within 2 days, he had every piece of information he needed: the exact location of the cottage, the terms of Rosalind's exile, the name of the woman who attended her, the amount of her allowance, £50, barely enough to survive, an insult disguised as charity. Within 3 days, Maximilian was on the road to Derbyshire, his carriage loaded with trunks and his mind made up with absolute finality. He told himself he was going to ensure she was safe, that he simply wanted to confirm she had adequate shelter and provisions, that his concern was purely humanitarian, the natural compassion of a man with means toward a woman who had been unjustly treated. But as his carriage rolled north through the winter landscape, through villages and farmland and stretches of empty moorland, Maximilian knew he was lying to himself. He was going to claim her. He had waited 2 years, had watched her from afar, had buried his desire beneath layers of duty and control and the iron discipline he had learned at his father's knee. But now she was alone, vulnerable, cast aside by the very people who should have protected her, and Maximilian would be damned if he let her remain in exile when he could offer her everything. Even if it meant revealing the truth he had hidden for so long. Even if it meant admitting that he had been in love with her since the moment he first saw her standing by those ballroom windows. even if it meant risking the one thing he had never risked before, his heart. She sat upright in bed, disoriented and frightened, her heart pounding against her ribs. Pale gray light seeped through the gaps in the thin curtains. It was barely dawn, perhaps 6 o'clock at most. Who would be calling at such an ungodly hour? Mrs. Davies wasn't due until Tuesday, and today was only Saturday. No one in the village knew her. No one had any reason to seek her out. The hammering came again, urgent and insistent, rattling the door in its frame. Rosalind threw back the covers and grabbed her dressing gown, pulling it on over her nightdress with trembling fingers. The cottage was freezing. The fire downstairs had died to ash during the night, and her breath misted in the cold air. She fumbled for her slippers and hurried down the narrow staircase, one hand on the rough wall for balance. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the bolt. Through the wooden panels, she could hear someone breathing heavily, as though they had been running or riding hard. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Open the door, Miss Pemberton." The voice was male, deep and commanding, utterly unfamiliar. But something in the tone, authoritative yet not threatening, urgent but controlled, made her hands move to the bolt almost without conscious thought. "I am not here to harm you. I give you my word as a gentleman." Rosalind slid back the bolt with shaking fingers and cracked the door open just wide enough to see who stood on her threshold. A man towered there in the gray dawn light. He was tall, perhaps a few inches over 6 feet, with broad shoulders encased in a greatcoat that was dusted with snow and road dirt. His dark hair was windswept and disheveled, falling across his forehead in a way that suggested he had been traveling hard and fast without concern for appearance. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, high cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, a mouth set in a grim line. But it was his eyes that made Rosalind's breath catch and hold, gray as winter storms, burning with an intensity that made her want simultaneously to step back in self-preservation and lean forward in fascination. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice emerging stronger than she felt. She gripped the edge of the door, ready to slam it shut if necessary. "Maximilian Hartwell," he said, and even exhausted and travel-worn, his voice carried absolute authority. "Duke of Lockwood." Rosalind's mind reeled. The Duke of Lockwood. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had heard of him. He was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, with estates that sprawled across 4 counties and business interests that reached to India and the Americas. He was known for his ruthless intelligence in matters of commerce, his complete disinterest in society's games and gossip, and his reputation as a man who never showed emotion, never lost control, never allowed anyone close enough to matter. What in God's name was he doing standing on her doorstep in a village so small it barely appeared on maps? "I don't understand," Rosalind said slowly, her fingers tightening on the door. "Why are you here? How did you even know where to find me?" "Because I heard what happened to you," Maximilian said, and something raw and fierce crept into his voice despite his obvious attempts at control. "And I could not stay away." "You heard—" Rosalind shook her head, confusion and disbelief warring in her chest. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I don't know you. We have never even been introduced. We have never spoken. I don't understand what you could possibly want with me." "I know." His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble-darkened skin. "But I have known you, Miss Pemberton, for 2 years. I have watched you at every ball, every assembly, every garden party and musical evening where our paths crossed. I have memorized the way you tilt your head when you are thinking deeply about something, the way you smile when you believe no one is looking and you allow yourself a moment of genuine pleasure, the way you move through a room as though you are observing a fascinating experiment rather than participating in shallow social theater. I have been waiting for the right moment to approach you, to speak to you, to tell you the truth." Rosalind stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in her fingertips where they gripped the door. "This cannot be real. You cannot be real." "I am real." Maximilian took a single step closer, though he was careful not to cross the threshold uninvited. Snow began to fall again, light flakes drifting down to settle on his dark hair and broad shoulders. And I am here because you refused to marry a man who would have destroyed you. Your father cast you out for it. Your family abandoned you. And now you are here, alone, living in exile because you chose yourself over security, because you refused to compromise your principles even when it cost you everything. Yes, Rosalind whispered, her throat tight. That is what happened. Then let me offer you a choice now, Maximilian said, his voice dropping to something fierce and tender and absolutely certain. Come with me. Marry me. Let me give you the life you should have had, the life you deserve. I will never ask you to compromise yourself. I will never force you into a role you do not wish to play. I will never treat you as property to be managed or a problem to be solved. I want you exactly as you are, Rosalind. Defiant and brilliant and utterly, completely unbroken. Rosalind's legs felt weak. She gripped the doorframe with both hands now, needing the support to remain standing. The world had tilted sideways. Nothing made sense. This powerful, intimidating Duke standing in the snow, saying words that should be impossible, offering her things she had not dared to dream about even in her most secret imaginings. You cannot mean this, she said, her voice shaking. You are the Duke of Lockwood. I am a disgraced woman with no dowry, no family, no prospects, no future. My father has disowned me. My name is ruined. I am living in a 2-room cottage on £50 a year. What could you possibly want with someone like me? Everything, Maximilian said simply, and the word hit her like a physical blow. I want everything you are, your intelligence that society tried to diminish, your courage that your father tried to punish, your refusal to be broken that cost you your place in the world. I want the woman who stood up to her father and chose exile over compromise. I want the woman who would rather have nothing than live a lie. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with an emotion she could not name. I am in love with you, Rosalind Pemberton. I have been in love with you since the moment I first saw you. And I will not stand by and watch you suffer alone in exile when I could be here, offering you everything I have, everything I am. Rosalind's eyes filled with hot tears that spilled over and ran down her cold cheeks. Why? The question burst from her, desperate and confused. You don't know me, not truly. You've watched me, yes, but that is not the same as knowing someone. Why would you ride all the way to Derbyshire in the middle of winter for a woman you've never even spoken to? Maximilian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, as though he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Because I am a coward, he said, and the admission seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. Because I have spent 2 years watching you from a distance, telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, when the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid. That you would see through me, see the parts of myself I keep hidden behind titles and duty and control. Afraid that you would reject me, not for my wealth or position, but for who I actually am beneath all of that. He drew in a shaking breath. But when I heard what happened to you, when I learned that you were suffering because you refused to compromise yourself, I realized that my fear was nothing compared to the thought of you here, alone, believing yourself abandoned and worthless. So I came. Because you deserve better than exile. Because you deserve to be valued for exactly who you are. Because I love you, and I cannot, I will not, stand aside any longer. The snow fell heavier now, swirling between them in the cold dawn air. Rosalind stood there in her nightdress and dressing gown, shivering, tears freezing on her cheeks, staring at this man who had appeared like something from a dream or a novel or a story too impossible to be true. And yet he was here, real and solid, and looking at her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Maximilian urged quietly. Let me come in. Let us talk. Let me prove to you that I am serious. That this is not some temporary madness, but something I have felt for 2 years. Something that has only grown stronger with time and distance. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment, This could be a mistake. He could be lying, manipulating her, taking advantage of her vulnerable position. She had every reason to be suspicious, to protect herself, to send him away. But when she looked into those storm-gray eyes, she saw something that resonated with the deepest truth inside herself. She saw someone who understood what it meant to be lonely, to be isolated, to wear a mask for the world while hiding your true self somewhere safe and unreachable. She saw someone like her. Trembling, Rosalind stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. "We should talk." Maximilian stepped into the tiny cottage and felt as though he had entered another world entirely. The cottage was nothing like the grand estates he inhabited. The ceiling was so low he had to duck slightly beneath the exposed beams. The parlor was barely large enough for the worn settee, the small table, and the two mismatched chairs. The fire had died to cold ash in the hearth. The morning light filtering through the thin curtains was gray and weak. And yet there was something about this place that felt more real, more honest, more true than any ballroom or drawing room or gilded palace he had ever occupied. Rosalind moved to the fireplace, kneeling awkwardly in her dressing gown, to coax the embers back to life, with practiced efficiency that suggested she had been doing this herself for days now. No servants to light her fires, no maids to dress her hair, no one to attend to the thousand small tasks that ladies of quality never even thought about. She had been living like this for less than a week, and already she had adapted. Already she had learned. Pride and rage and fierce protectiveness surged through Maximilian in equal measure. "Please, sit," Rosalind said, gesturing to the settee without looking at him. Her hands shook slightly as she added kindling to the struggling flames. "I apologize for the cold. I have not yet mastered the art of keeping fires burning through the night." "You should not have to master it," Maximilian said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You should have servants to do this for you. You should be warm and comfortable and safe." "I am safe," Rosalind said quietly, finally coaxing the fire into something resembling warmth. She stood, brushing ash from her hands, and turned to face him. "I am safer here than I would have been married to Richard Talbot." The absolute certainty in her voice made something inside Maximilian's chest crack open wider. "Tell me about him," he said, settling onto the settee with care, aware that he was far too large for this delicate furniture. "Tell me what he did to you." Rosalind wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable than she had moments before. "He was cruel," she said simply. "Not in obvious ways, not in ways that society would condemn, but in small, insidious ways that would have destroyed me slowly over years." She moved to the window, staring out at the falling snow. "He grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise when I hesitated about announcing our engagement. He told me I belonged to him now, that my father had signed the contracts, that I had no choice. He spoke to me as though I were a horse he had purchased, a possession to be managed. And when I pulled away and refused him publicly, he lied. He told everyone I had led him on, that I had allowed him liberties and then cruelly rejected him. He tried to destroy my reputation to salvage his wounded pride." Maximilian's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "If he were here now, I would kill him." Rosalind turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You believe me?" "Of course I believe you." Maximilian's voice was fierce. "Why would you lie? You have already paid the highest price possible for refusing him. You have nothing to gain by fabricating stories about his character." "My father did not believe me," Rosalind said softly. "My mother did not believe me. They said I was being dramatic, that all men were firm with their future wives, that I was too sensitive, too romantic, too foolish to understand the reality of marriage." "Your father is a fool," Maximilian said bluntly, "and your mother is a coward. They should have protected you. They should have believed you. They should have ended the engagement the moment you expressed discomfort." Rosalind's eyes filled with tears again. "Thank you," she whispered. "You cannot know what it means to have someone believe me." Maximilian stood, unable to remain seated when she looked so lost and broken. He crossed the small room to stand before her, close but not touching, giving her space to retreat if she needed it. Rosalind, he said quietly, and her name on his lips felt sacred somehow, precious. I need you to understand something. I did not come here on impulse. I did not wake up 3 days ago and decide on a whim to travel to Derbyshire in the middle of winter to propose to a woman I have never spoken to. He forced himself to meet her eyes, to let her see the truth he had hidden for so long. I have been watching you for 2 years because I could not look away. Every time I saw you, every time you entered a room, it was as though the air changed, as though suddenly I could breathe more deeply. You made me feel things I had convinced myself I was incapable of feeling. What things? Rosalind asked, her voice barely audible. Hope, Maximilian said. Joy, the possibility that there might be someone in this world who would see me, truly see me, not my title or my wealth or my power, and want what they found beneath all of that. He paused, gathering courage. My father was a cold man, Rosalind. He taught me that emotion is weakness, that vulnerability is dangerous, that love is a liability that destroys men. He married my mother for her dowry and her connections, and he treated her like a piece of furniture, valuable to be maintained, but not to be loved. When she died, he did not grieve. He simply remarried within 6 months to another woman with adequate breeding and fortune. Rosalind's hand came up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with sympathy. I swore I would never become him, Maximilian continued, his voice rough. I swore I would never marry without love, that I would never treat a woman as property. But I also absorbed his lessons. I learned to keep people at a distance. I learned to control my emotions. I learned that showing weakness invites destruction. He took a shaking breath. And then I saw you, and everything I thought I knew about myself shattered. Because I wanted you with a ferocity that terrified me. And I did not know how to reach for you without risking everything I had built to protect myself. So you stayed away, Rosalind said softly. Yes. The admission tasted like failure. I stayed away. I watched you. I learned everything I could about you. And I told myself I was being cautious, strategic, waiting for the right moment. But the truth is, I was afraid that if I approached you, if I laid my heart bare, you would reject me. And I did not know if I could survive that. Rosalind searched his face with those intelligent eyes that missed nothing. What changed? You did, Maximilian said simply. You chose yourself over security. You refused to compromise. You accepted exile rather than live a lie. And I realized that my fear was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the courage you showed. If you could be that brave, then I could be brave too. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. He closed his hands around hers, trying to warm them. I am here, Rosalind, because I love you, because I have loved you for 2 years, because I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are valued, that you are worthy, that choosing yourself was the bravest and most beautiful thing you could have done. Marry me. Come with me to London. Let me give you everything. Rosalind looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not pull away. I am afraid, she whispered. Of what? Maximilian asked gently. Of believing you, of hoping, of wanting this so desperately that I ignore reason and caution and common sense. Her voice broke. I have lost everything, Maximilian, my family, my home, my place in the world. If I give you my heart and you break it, I will have nothing left. Then I will not break it, Maximilian said fiercely. I swear to you, Rosalind, on everything I hold sacred, I will spend every day of our marriage proving that your trust was not misplaced. I will never lie to you. I will never manipulate you. I will never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are. How can you promise that? Rosalind asked. You barely know me. I know everything that matters, Maximilian countered. I know you are brave. I know you are principled. I know you value truth over comfort, integrity over security. I know you refuse to let your father or Richard Talbot or society break you. That is all I need to know, Rosalind. The rest, the details of your favorite books, your opinions on politics, whether you prefer morning walks or evening rides, those are things I will learn. Those are the pleasures of a lifetime spent together. Rosalind was silent for a long moment, her hand warm now in his, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read his soul. I need time, she said finally, to think, to understand what this would mean, to be certain. Of course. Maximilian squeezed her hand gently, relief flooding through him that she had not refused outright. Take all the time you need. I have taken rooms at the inn in the village. I will stay as long as you require, and when you are ready, if you are ready, I will make you my duchess. And if I decide I cannot do this? Rosalind asked quietly. If I decide the risk is too great? Pain lanced through Maximilian's chest, but he forced himself to answer honestly. Then I will go. I will not pressure you, or manipulate you, or try to force your hand. Your choice must be freely made, or it means nothing. Rosalind nodded slowly. Then, surprising them both, she stepped closer and rose on her toes to press a soft, brief kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for believing me, for coming here. Maximilian closed his eyes, committing this moment to memory, the warmth of her lips, the scent of her skin, the feel of her so close he could count her heartbeats. Always, he murmured, always, Rosalind. Maximilian stayed in Millbrook for 3 days. He took rooms at the village inn, much to the astonishment of the innkeeper, Mr. Griggs, who had never, in his 47 years of running the establishment, hosted anyone more distinguished than a traveling cloth merchant. The Duke's presence caused a sensation in the tiny village. Speculation ran rampant. What was he doing here? Why was he calling daily on Miss Pemberton in her cottage? Were they courting? Was she some secret relation? A ward? A former servant? Maximilian ignored the gossip entirely. Every morning he called on Rosalind at precisely 10 o'clock. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily despite the strangeness of their situation. Maximilian told her about his childhood in detail now, painting a picture of a lonely boy raised in a cold, magnificent house by a father who valued power above all else. He described his mother, gentle and kind, but ultimately powerless against her husband's cruelty. He spoke of the expectations that had been drilled into him from birth, to be perfect, to show no weakness, to value duty and legacy above personal happiness. Rosalind listened with rapt attention, her eyes soft with understanding, and then she shared her own story. She told him about growing up as the eldest daughter, always expected to set the example, to sacrifice her own wants for her sister's needs. She described her father's increasing pressure as she reached marriageable age, his anger each time she refused an offer, his insistence that she was being selfish and foolish and ungrateful. He told me love was a luxury that daughters of minor barons could not afford, Rosalind said one afternoon, as they sat before her small fire, tea cooling between them. He said I should be grateful any man of decent breeding would have me, given our family's modest circumstances. My happiness was irrelevant. My duty was to marry well and provide connections that would help my sisters. And yet you refused, Maximilian said quietly. I refused, Rosalind agreed, because I realized that if I married Richard Talbot, I would spend the rest of my life trying to make myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. I would have to bury everything true about myself just to survive the marriage, and I decided I would rather have nothing than live that way. You were braver than I have ever been, Maximilian said, reaching across the small space to take her hand. This was easier now, this touching. She no longer flinched or pulled away. I did what was expected of me for 32 years. I became exactly who my father wanted me to be. It was only when I saw you that I realized how much of myself I had buried in the process. On the second day, they walked together along the frozen stream that ran behind the cottage, their breath misting in the cold air. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The sky was that peculiar shade of white-gray that promised more snow before evening. "Tell me about Lockwood Hall," Rosalind said as they walked. "What is it like?" Maximilian considered the question. "Magnificent," he said finally. "And empty. It has 60 rooms, gardens that span 50 acres, art and furniture worth a fortune. But until now, it has never felt like a home, just a beautiful shell I inhabit because it is expected of me." "And you think I could change that?" Rosalind asked skeptically. "I know you could," Maximilian said with certainty, "because you make me feel things I have not felt since my mother died. Hope, joy, the possibility of genuine happiness rather than mere contentment." On the third day, as heavy snow began to fall, Rosalind invited him in for tea. They sat by the fire, the silence between them, comfortable now, familiar, filled with the ease of two people who had found unexpected understanding. "I have a question," Rosalind said suddenly, setting down her teacup. "Ask me anything." "Why me?" She turned to face him directly, her gaze searching and honest. "Truly, Maximilian, you are the Duke of Lockwood. You are wealthy beyond measure, powerful, influential. You could have anyone, a duke's daughter, an earl's sister. Any woman in England would be honored by your suit. Why choose a disgraced woman living in exile in a cottage in the middle of nowhere?" Maximilian set down his own cup and leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He had known this question would come. He had prepared for it. But now, looking at her in the firelight, seeing the genuine confusion and wonder in her expression, all his carefully prepared speeches dissolved. "Because when I look at you, Rosalind," he said quietly, "I see everything I have ever wanted and everything I have been too afraid to reach for. You are intelligent in a world that punishes female intelligence. You are principled in a society that values compliance over integrity. You are brave enough to choose yourself even when it costs you everything. You refuse to be broken by cruelty and injustice." His voice grew rougher, more urgent. "And when I am with you, I feel as though I can finally breathe. As though the armor I have worn for 32 years can finally come off. You see me, Rosalind, not the Duke of Lockwood, not my fortune or my estates or my influence. You see me, the man beneath all of that, and you do not flinch away from what you find." He reached for her hand. "I do not want someone who will bow to my every whim or play the role of the perfect duchess. I want someone who will challenge me, who will make me better, who will remind me that there is more to life than power and duty and control. I want you, Rosalind, not despite your defiance, but because of it. Not despite your disgrace, but because it proves you have courage I can only aspire to." Rosalind's breath caught. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the firelight. "You truly mean this," she whispered, and it was not a question this time. "I have never meant anything more in my entire life." She stood abruptly, crossing to the window to stare out at the falling snow. Maximilian watched her, his heart pounding, barely breathing as he waited for her decision. "If I marry you," Rosalind said slowly, her back still to him, "I will not be the kind of duchess society expects. I will not simper or flatter or play political games. I will speak my mind. I will make mistakes. I will probably embarrass you at some point." "You could never embarrass me," Maximilian said, rising to stand behind her, close but not touching. "You will be exactly who you are, and that is all I have ever wanted." Rosalind turned to face him, and in the pale afternoon light, her eyes were bright with tears and something else, something that looked like hope. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, Maximilian, I will marry you." For a moment, Maximilian simply stared at her, unable to quite believe what he was hearing. The woman he had loved from a distance for 2 years, the woman he had crossed half of England to find, the woman who had haunted his dreams and consumed his waking thoughts, had just agreed to be his wife. And then he was moving, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that belied the fierce joy surging through him. "Say it again," he breathed, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, catching the tears that continued to fall. Please, Rosalind, I need to hear it again. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. Yes, I will marry you, Maximilian Hartwell. I will be your wife. I will take the risk. I will choose hope over fear. Maximilian bent his head and kissed her. The kiss was everything he had imagined, and nothing like he had imagined all at once. It was fierce and tender, desperate and reverent, a claiming and a surrender and a promise all bound together. Rosalind's hands came up to grip his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat as she kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring 2 years of loneliness and fear and desperate hope into the press of her lips against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and trembling, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his heart pounding so hard he thought she must be able to feel it. I will make you happy, he murmured against her skin. I swear to you, Rosalind, I will spend every day of our marriage proving that your trust was not misplaced. Just love me, Rosalind whispered, her fingers moving to trace the sharp line of his jaw. That is all I need, Maximilian. Just love me, and let me love you in return. Always, he promised, the word a vow more sacred than any spoken in a church. Always, Rosalind, for as long as I draw breath. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the snow falling soft and steady outside the cottage windows, the fire crackling in the hearth, the rest of the world forgotten entirely. Finally, reluctantly, Maximilian stepped back, though he kept her hand clasped firmly in his. We should leave tomorrow, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to marry you as soon as possible. I have already secured a special license. We can be wed within the week. Rosalind's eyes widened. You already have a license? But you came here not knowing if I would accept you. I came here knowing I would not leave without you, Maximilian said simply. Whether you agreed to marry me immediately or whether I needed to spend months courting you properly, I was prepared to do whatever was necessary. The license was simply insurance. Hope made tangible. A smile bloomed across Rosalind's face, transforming her features from pretty to absolutely radiant. You are a very determined man, Your Grace. I am a man in love, Maximilian corrected, and when a man finds the woman who makes him whole, he does not hesitate. He does not hedge his bets. He commits completely. Then I suppose we should begin packing, Rosalind said, glancing around the tiny cottage that had been her home for less than a week. Though I warn you, I do not have much to bring. You are bringing yourself, Maximilian said, raising her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. That is everything I need. They left Millbrook the following morning, just as dawn broke cold and clear over the snow-covered village. Maximilian had spent the previous evening making arrangements with characteristic efficiency. His carriage had been brought from the inn and prepared for the journey. His servants had packed his belongings, and he had visited Mrs. Davies personally to thank her for her care of Rosalind, and to provide her with a sum of money so generous that the poor woman had wept into her apron. You take care of our Miss Pemberton, Mrs. Davies had said fiercely, gripping Maximilian's hand with surprising strength. She's a good girl, braver than most. She deserves every happiness. I know, Maximilian had replied quietly, and I intend to give it to her. Now, as Rosalind emerged from the cottage in her traveling cloak, her single trunk already loaded onto the carriage, Maximilian felt his chest tighten with emotion. She looked so small standing there in the snow, so vulnerable, clutching a worn leather satchel that he knew contained the few books she treasured most. She had lost everything for the sake of her principles. Her family, her home, her place in society, her future, and now she was trusting him to give her a new future, a better one. He would not fail her. Ready? He asked softly, offering his hand to help her into the carriage. Rosalind looked back at the cottage one last time. It had been her prison and her sanctuary, the place where she had discovered both the depths of loneliness and the strength of her own spirit. She had arrived in disgrace and exile. She was leaving with hope and love and a man who looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in his world. "I am ready," she said, placing her hand in Maximilian's and allowing him to hand her up into the luxurious interior of his traveling carriage. As the carriage rolled away from Millbrook, Rosalind watched through the window as the village disappeared behind them. The cottage grew smaller and smaller until it was just a dark smudge against the white landscape, and then it was gone entirely, swallowed by distance and the curve of the road. She did not cry, she did not mourn. Instead, she turned to face forward, toward the future, toward the unknown, toward the man sitting beside her, who had crossed England to claim her. Maximilian's hand found hers in the warm interior of the carriage, his fingers lacing through hers with a certainty that spoke of permanence and promise. "Tell me about London," Rosalind said as the miles rolled away beneath them. "What will it be like?" Maximilian considered the question carefully. "Overwhelming at first, I imagine. My townhouse is in Mayfair, in the heart of society. It will be vastly different from the cottage, from anything you have known. But I want you to remember something, Rosalind." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "You are about to become the Duchess of Lockwood. That means you will have power, influence, the ability to shape your own life in ways you never could as the daughter of a minor baron. Society will judge you, yes, they will. Gossip about our whirlwind courtship and your scandalous past. But you will also have my name, my wealth, and my absolute support in facing them down." "You make it sound like a battle," Rosalind said, half amused, half anxious. "It will be at first," Maximilian admitted. "The Tun does not easily accept those who have been labeled as disgraced. But I have never cared what the Tun thinks of me, and I will not allow them to treat you with anything less than the respect you deserve. You are going to be my Duchess, my wife, my partner, and anyone who cannot accept that will find themselves on the wrong side of the Duke of Lockwood's displeasure." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Rosalind's throat tighten with emotion. She had spent so much of her life trying to navigate society's expectations alone, with parents who valued reputation over her happiness, and sisters who needed her to conform so they could succeed. The idea of having someone powerful and influential standing beside her, defending her, believing in her worth, it was almost too much to comprehend. "What if I make mistakes?" she asked quietly. "What if I embarrass you or damage your reputation?" "Then we will face the consequences together," Maximilian said simply. "Rosalind, I need you to understand something. I am not marrying you to acquire a perfect duchess who never puts a foot wrong. I am marrying you because you are brave and intelligent and principled, because you refuse to compromise yourself, because you chose integrity over security. Those qualities do not change simply because you put on a title. You will still be yourself, and I will still love you." Rosalind blinked back tears. "I am not accustomed to being valued for who I am rather than what I can provide." "Then become accustomed to it," Maximilian said gently, echoing his words from days before. "Because I will spend our entire marriage reminding you." The journey to London took 3 days over winter roads that were treacherous with ice and snow. They stopped at coaching inns along the way, Maximilian always securing separate rooms to protect Rosalind's reputation, even as every fiber of his being wanted to claim her as his own. But he had promised to do this properly, to give her a wedding and a marriage that honored rather than diminished her, and he would keep that promise no matter how difficult it proved. During the long hours in the carriage, they talked about everything and nothing. Rosalind told him about the books she loved, poetry and philosophy and natural history. Maximilian shared his passion for architecture and his growing interest in parliamentary reform. They discovered, shared opinions on subjects ranging from the treatment of the poor to the importance of education for all children, regardless of class. "You sound like a radical," Rosalind teased after one particularly impassioned discussion about workhouse conditions. "I suppose I am," Maximilian admitted. "I have the wealth and position to effect real change, Rosalind. It seems criminally wasteful not to use those advantages to improve the lives of those who have neither." Then we shall be radicals together, Rosalind declared, and the joy in her eyes made Maximilian's heart ache with love. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a hill, and London spread out before them, a vast sprawl of buildings and church spires and smoking chimneys that stretched as far as the eye could see. Rosalind pressed her face to the carriage window, her eyes wide with wonder and apprehension. "It is enormous," she breathed. "It is home," Maximilian said quietly. "Our home now, Rosalind. Together." The townhouse in Mayfair was everything Rosalind had feared and more. It was a magnificent structure of pale stone and soaring columns, with windows that gleamed like mirrors, and a front door that looked as though it could withstand a siege. Servants in immaculate livery lined up to greet them as the carriage pulled to a stop, their faces carefully neutral as they waited to meet the woman who would soon be their Duchess. Maximilian handed Rosalind down from the carriage with exquisite care, his hand at her elbow steady and reassuring. "Welcome home, Rosalind," he murmured, and then he turned to address his staff. "This is Miss Rosalind Pemberton, who will very shortly become the Duchess of Lockwood. You will accord her every courtesy and respect due to her position. Mrs. Thornton," he addressed the housekeeper, a formidable woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, "please show Miss Pemberton to the Rose Suite and ensure she has everything she requires." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Thornton said, curtsying deeply before turning to Rosalind with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly. "This way, miss. I think you will find the Rose Suite quite comfortable." The Rose Suite turned out to be a set of rooms so luxurious that Rosalind had to suppress the urge to laugh at the sheer absurdity of it. The bedroom alone was larger than the entire ground floor of the cottage in Millbrook. The bed was an enormous four-poster draped in silk the color of blush roses. The sitting room had windows overlooking the gardens and furniture that looked too beautiful to actually use. There was a dressing room with wardrobes that stood empty and accusing, reminding her that she had arrived with a single trunk containing perhaps 6 gowns, none of them remotely suitable for a duchess. Mrs. Thornton seemed to read her thoughts. "His Grace has already sent for the modiste, miss. She will be here first thing in the morning to begin outfitting you properly. In the meantime, if there is anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ring." After Mrs. Thornton left, Rosalind sank onto the edge of the impossibly soft bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 4 days. 4 days ago, she had been alone in a tiny cottage, convinced she would spend the rest of her life in exile and obscurity. Now she was sitting in a duchess's bedroom in one of the finest houses in London, preparing to marry a man who looked at her as though she had hung the moon and stars. It was too much. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying, and wonderful, and completely surreal. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting a maid. Instead, Maximilian entered, his expression concerned. "Mrs. Thornton said you looked overwhelmed. I wanted to make certain you were well." Rosalind laughed, the sound slightly hysterical even to her own ears. "Well, I am sitting in a room that could house my entire family, preparing to become a duchess, and 4 days ago I was living on £50 a year in a cottage with a leaking roof. I am not certain well is the appropriate word." Maximilian crossed the room to sit beside her on the bed, careful to maintain a respectable distance, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "It is a great deal of change very quickly," he acknowledged. "If you need time to adjust, to breathe, we can delay the wedding. I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "No," Rosalind said quickly, turning to face him. "I do not want to delay. I am overwhelmed, yes, but I am also happy. Happier than I have been in longer than I can remember. I just need to adjust to the fact that this is real, that you are real, that this is truly my life now." Maximilian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "It is real, Rosalind. I am real. This is your life now, and I promise you, we will face everything that comes together. You are not alone anymore." Those last words broke something open inside her. Rosalind had been alone for so long, isolated by her refusal to conform, abandoned by her family, exiled to the edges of the world. The idea that she would never have to face that loneliness again, that she would have someone standing beside her no matter what came, was almost too much to bear. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Maximilian's shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, sandalwood and leather and something uniquely his own. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me." Maximilian's arms came around her, holding her with a careful tenderness that suggested she was something infinitely precious. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for being brave enough to say yes." The wedding took place 3 days later in a small chapel tucked away in a quiet corner of London. Maximilian had wanted to give Rosalind the grandest wedding England had ever seen, to proclaim to all of society that he was proud to call her his wife. But Rosalind had gently refused. She wanted something intimate, something real, something that belonged to them rather than to the expectations and judgments of the ton. So they stood before a minister and a handful of carefully chosen witnesses, Maximilian's closest friend, Lord Thomas Ashford, and his kind-hearted wife, Lady Caroline, and a few trusted servants who had known Maximilian since he was a boy, and who looked at Rosalind with genuine warmth and approval. Rosalind wore a gown that had been completed in record time by Madame Lisette, the most sought-after modiste in London. It was ivory silk, with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline, simple but elegant, perfectly suited to Rosalind's understated beauty. Her dark hair had been dressed by a maid with gentle hands, arranged in soft curls with a few tiny white roses woven through. As she walked down the short aisle toward Maximilian, Rosalind felt her breath catch. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, his dark hair carefully styled, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though she was the only person in the world. When she reached him, he took her hand, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was just as nervous and overwhelmed as she was. They spoke their vows quietly, their voices steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm them both. Rosalind promised to love, honor, and cherish him, and she meant every word with a fierceness that surprised her. This man had seen her at her lowest, had believed in her worth when everyone else had abandoned her, had crossed England to offer her a future when she thought she had none. Maximilian promised to love, honor, and protect her, and Rosalind heard the absolute truth in his voice, the unwavering commitment that came from a man who had spent his entire life guarding his heart, and had finally, irrevocably, given it away. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Maximilian kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Lady Caroline's eyes and a knowing smile to Lord Thomas's face. Afterward, at the small wedding breakfast held in the townhouse, Lord Thomas pulled Maximilian aside while the ladies examined the modest wedding cake. "You are certain about this, Max?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. "She is not what society expected for the Duke of Lockwood." Maximilian's eyes found Rosalind across the room, where she was speaking with Lady Caroline, her face animated, her laugh genuine and unforced. "She is everything I never knew I needed," Maximilian said quietly. "She is brave and principled and utterly unafraid to be herself. She has already made me a better man, Thomas, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making her happy." Thomas studied his friend for a long moment, then clapped him on the shoulder with genuine warmth. "Then I am happy for you, my friend, truly. She is a remarkable woman, and you are a fortunate man." "I know," Maximilian said simply, and the wonder in his voice made Thomas smile. That evening, as the last of the guests departed and the servants cleared away the remnants of the celebration, Maximilian and Rosalind found themselves alone in the drawing room. Rosalind stood at the window, looking out at the London streets lit by gas lamps, still trying to fully comprehend that this was her life now. She was the Duchess of Lockwood. She lived in this magnificent house. She was married to the man who stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. "What are you thinking?" Maximilian asked softly, coming to stand beside her. "That a week ago I was in exile, convinced my life was over," Rosalind said honestly. "And now I am here, Married to you, beginning a new life I never dared to imagine. Do you regret it? Maximilian asked, and she heard the vulnerability beneath the casual tone. No. Rosalind turned to face him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. I do not regret it for a moment. I am overwhelmed, yes. Uncertain about what comes next, absolutely. But I am also happier than I have ever been. Relief flooded Maximilian's features. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his heart. I was afraid, he admitted, that you would wake up and realize you had made a terrible mistake, that you had married me out of desperation rather than genuine feeling. Maximilian, Rosalind said firmly, her eyes locking onto his, I married you because you are the only man who has ever seen me, truly seen me, and loved what you found. I married you because you crossed half of England in the middle of winter to offer me a future when mine had been destroyed. I married you because when I look at you, I see someone who understands loneliness and isolation and the cost of wearing a mask for the world. I married you because I love you. It was the first time she had said the words aloud, and they hung in the air between them, precious and irrevocable. Maximilian's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. I love you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I have loved you for 2 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life. He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise, and Rosalind surrendered to it, to him, to the future they would build together. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers. Come, he said softly. Let me show you Lockwood Hall. Let me take you home. 6 months later. Rosalind stood in the grand drawing room of Lockwood Hall, hosting her first major social event as the Duchess of Lockwood. The room was filled with some of the most influential people in England, politicians and intellectuals, artists and reformers, carefully chosen not for their titles or their wealth, but for their minds and their character. This was not a traditional society ball. This was something new, something that reflected both Maximilian's progressive ideals and Rosalind's fierce intelligence. She moved through the gathered guests with quiet confidence, engaging in substantive conversations about education reform and workers' rights and the latest archaeological discoveries. Her gown was beautiful, but not ostentatious, her jewels real but modest by ducal standards. She was exactly herself, intelligent, principled, unafraid to speak her mind, and the guests responded to her authenticity with genuine warmth and respect. Across the room, Maximilian watched his wife with undisguised pride and love. Your Duchess is remarkable, Lord Thomas commented, appearing at Maximilian's elbow with a glass of wine. She has completely won over even the most skeptical members of the ton. She is extraordinary, Maximilian agreed simply. And I am the most fortunate man in England. As if sensing his gaze, Rosalind glanced over and caught his eye. The smile she gave him was intimate and private, a reminder of the life they had built together over the past 6 months, a life of partnership and mutual respect and love that had grown deeper with every passing day. Later, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, they stood together on the terrace of Lockwood Hall, looking out over the moonlit gardens. I received a letter from my father today, Rosalind said quietly. Maximilian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on hers. What did he want? To reconcile. Rosalind's voice was steady, devoid of bitterness. He has heard of my success as your Duchess, of my position in society. He wishes to mend our relationship, to claim me as his daughter once again. And what did you tell him? Maximilian asked, though he thought he already knew. Rosalind looked up at her husband, the man who had given her everything, who had seen her worth when no one else could. I told him that I have a family now, she said softly, a real family, built on love and respect, rather than duty and expectation. I told him that I wish him well, but that I have no place in my life for people who valued me only when it became convenient or advantageous. Maximilian's arms came around her, pulling her close against his chest. "I am proud of you," he murmured into her hair. "I learned from the best," Rosalind said, tilting her head back to look at him. "You taught me that I am worthy of love and respect exactly as I am. You taught me that I do not need to diminish myself to deserve happiness. You taught me that saying no to the wrong things creates space for the right things to enter my life." "And you," Maximilian said, his voice rough with emotion, "taught me that love is not a weakness to be feared, but a strength to be embraced. That vulnerability does not make me less powerful. It makes me more human. That the walls I built to protect myself were actually a prison, and you set me free." They stood together in the moonlight, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built something real and true from the ashes of exile and loneliness. Rosalind had been banished for refusing to settle, cast out by a family that could not see her worth. And in that exile, she had found everything. A man who loved her for exactly who she was. A partnership built on truth and mutual respect. A future that belonged entirely to them. She had been exiled for choosing herself, and she had been claimed by a duke who saw her defiance as the most beautiful thing about her. The scandal of her banishment had faded into distant memory, replaced by new stories, new gossip, new dramas. But the love she had found in that cold cottage in Millbrook, the choice she had made to trust and hope and risk her heart, that endured. That would endure forever. "I love you," Rosalind whispered, reaching up to touch Maximilian's face. "And I love you," Maximilian replied, bending to kiss her with all the tenderness and passion and absolute certainty that had carried them through exile to triumph. "Always, Rosalind. For as long as I draw breath and beyond." And beneath the stars, in the gardens of Lockwood Hall, they stood together, Duke and Duchess, husband and wife, two halves of one extraordinary whole, and knew that they had found what most people spend their entire lives searching for. They had found home in each other. The end,